Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is there any way to persuade someone who's narcissistic? I've heard other versions of the same question. Is there any way to reason with somebody who's narcissistic? Is there any way to encourage behavioral change? So kind of this theme here, this idea that you could talk to somebody who's narcissistic and maybe convince them to do something that they're not doing, to elicit or facilitate some sort of positive change. So the example I'm going to use here is going to be in a professional setting. This would likely also apply to a social setting, but not necessarily a romantic setting. That's a little bit different. If somebody's in a romantic relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, I think that would take on a different quality than what I'm describing here in terms of the tactics. It's important to note here that narcissism, of course, is on a continuum. So if we say somebody's narcissistic, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We'd have to know what traits they have and to what extent. So it goes on a continuum from healthy, normal, and adaptive on one end, all the way over to pathological on the other end. And one of the pathologies that's associated with narcissism would be narcissistic personality disorder. But somebody wouldn't necessarily have to have that to have narcissism that's interfering in their life, or to have narcissism that's making it difficult to interact with them or to elicit change. So we see that there are two types of narcissism. Both are self-centered and both involve self-deception, which we think of as protective. So we have grandiose narcissism. We see here a sense of entitlement, arrogance, social dominance, being confident. Somebody who has grandiose narcissistic features genuinely believes they are superior. So they believe they have accomplished something that makes them superior. It's not something they have to guess about or wonder. It doesn't really have insecurity. It has confidence. So when somebody approaches them and says, hey, I have thoughts about how you could change, they devalue that person and whatever they say. So somebody who has grandiose narcissistic features doesn't need or care about feedback unless it's positive, and this is really one of the keys I'll get to later. Now with the other type of narcissism, this is called vulnerable narcissism. And here we see, again, I mentioned the self-centeredness and self-deception, but also hypersensitivity to criticism, which of course could be a problem if you're trying to elicit change in somebody. We see insecurity, anger, aggression, and a lot of shame. So somebody who has vulnerable narcissistic features doesn't fully believe that they are superior. They are trying to believe they're superior, but they don't quite buy the self-deception. So another way to think about this is their self-deception is just not as good. So in a sense, somebody who has vulnerable narcissism is a little more realistic than somebody who has grandiose narcissism because they're not fully buying into the idea that they are superior. So somebody who has vulnerable narcissism devalues a person just like what we see with grandiose narcissism, but they overvalue what they say and work to contradict it, work to prove that it's not true. So if you criticize somebody who has vulnerable narcissism, they're going to be kind of aggressive or at least assertive, right? They're not going to be happy with that criticism. Whereas somebody who has grandiose narcissism will likely ignore the criticism and it won't faze them or hurt them. They're not hypersensitive like we see with vulnerable narcissism. So somebody who has vulnerable narcissism does care what somebody else says, and they do need positive feedback. So with both of these types of narcissism, we see what people with these traits do is they reject useful advice. This is part of being passive-aggressive, which of course is also associated with narcissism. They won't admit fault, which of course stops learning. When we stop admitting that we're making mistakes, we're not learning anymore. And being wrong to somebody who's narcissistic means they're bad. It hurts. So it's not something that they can really accept. And this, of course, is a problem when you're trying to facilitate change in somebody with narcissism. So when criticism is taken off the table in terms of trying to negotiate change with somebody, that's a real problem. Constructive criticism is a very valuable tool for helping people to change. Only people that are secure and have normal or low narcissism are able to really accept that type of feedback in the way it's intended. People who are narcissistic, of course, as I mentioned, have trouble with that. They have trouble with criticism. So if we use an analogy here, imagine that you're in an abandoned city and you're driving a car. But the car will only turn right. It won't turn left. Maybe a little bit, but not enough to make like a left turn. You could go anywhere in that city, but just not as efficiently, right? So if you think about this analogy in terms of narcissism, we're cut off from an important communication tool, but we're not cut off completely. So we can still turn the car right, we just can't turn it left. Now, you might say with extreme narcissism, a better analogy would be that the car tires are almost flat, right? So it's uncomfortable and slow, and you may not get to where you're going because one or more of the tires could just completely fail. But either way, we have some types of communication available and other types aren't really as available. So what we really see here is a narrow band of well-received communication. Of course, you can say anything to anybody. You can criticize somebody who's narcissistic, but that won't be well-received. The narrow band includes two pretty important types of communication. Negative information about others, because of course that makes somebody who's narcissistic feel good about themselves, and positive information about them. That's all you really get with narcissism in terms of what I'm looking at here today and how to reason or persuade with somebody who's narcissistic. Those are really the two most effective types of communication. Again, those are the types that are well received. So as we can see here with narcissism, criticism is worse than useless. It'll actually propel somebody toward the undesired behavior. So we have to think about what types of communication are in that narrow band, and can we use them to facilitate change. So the scenario I'm using for this video in terms of illustrate these methods of change, these tactics, will involve a work setting. Let's say it's an office setting. And there are different types of workers in the office. And one of those types would be maintenance workers, individuals who fix things that are broken, who paint, who clean, things like that. Some people might refer to them as janitorial staff. But either way, you have this type of worker in the office. And then you have somebody who's narcissistic, and the problem here that you want to change is the individual who's narcissistic is condescending toward the maintenance staff. And of course, they're not condescending toward anyone else. So it really kind of stands out that they are believing that they're in a higher status level, right? So this would be the behavior that I'm going to use as the example for these strategies. And I believe that these strategies, to the degree that they are effective, are really equally as effective with grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. You could make certainly an argument that one might be a little better with grandiose and the other better with vulnerable, but I haven't really seen much of a difference. So these two strategies really involve the two types of communication I mentioned before. Something negative about other people and something positive about the person who's narcissistic. I think the positive route, which I'll get to second here, I think this is a better strategy, but I want to cover both. So I'm going to start with the negative information about others and how this can be used to facilitate change. Now, before I get into this too much, it is important to realize that this isn't about clinical change. This isn't about techniques that a counselor would use with a client. With the second one I'm talking about, there could be a little bit of overlap, but I don't really see much overlap at all in this first scenario where we're using negative information about others to facilitate change. Now, with this strategy, of course, like all strategies, this requires care. So the strategy here, what would be done would be to pick someone else. This wouldn't be a real person with the same behavior as the narcissist. So you want to keep the parallels there, but a little bit distant, because you don't want to be exactly like what the person is doing. So for example, you could pick someone on a TV show that's condescending to other people, someone in a movie, something like that. A fictitious character that's manifesting a similar behavior, but not exactly similar. And what you do is you discuss this third party with the narcissist, kind of trying to get them to agree with you, to agree that the behavior manifested by this character is unacceptable, and really they should be referred to or thought of as narcissistic. And I think in most situations it's okay to actually use that word. So really what you're saying is this fictitious character is narcissistic, because they're engaging in behaviors similar to what the narcissist is doing. So really here, there's an opportunity for the narcissist to learn without being confronted or embarrassed. So in a sense, this is bypassing the narcissism, but in another sense, it's actually using the narcissism in order to communicate. Now, the shortcomings with this tactic, of course, is the narcissist could actually agree with the fictional character's behavior, right? They could identify with that behavior and think there's nothing wrong with it, so that would lead to a bad outcome. And sometimes they could figure it out. They could realize you're really talking about their behavior, and that would mean they're going to get very defensive, and all progress is going to stop at that point. So again, it's crucial to have different details, but still retain the moral of the story. So to sum up with this tactic, find a fictitious character engaging in a similar behavior, and try to get the individual who's narcissistic to identify with that story and kind of come onto your side in agreeing that that behavior is unacceptable. Now, the second effective way to communicate with somebody who's narcissistic is to say positive things about them. I like this method a lot better, but it's tricky for other reasons, right? The problem I've noticed with this tactic is that people who are not narcissistic don't want to say things about somebody who is narcissistic, right? There's kind of a repulsion there. So if somebody's not narcissistic and they're told, hey, here's a person with narcissism, go tell them how great they are. The non-narcissistic person is really not going to appreciate that and probably not going to buy into it too much, right? So I think this one is tricky just like the other one, but in a different way. I think it's tricky for a different reason. But either way, we know that individuals who are narcissistic, they're attentive to this. They want admiration. So saying something positive about them will get their attention. And really there are two strategies that you could put under this main strategy of positive information about the narcissist. The first one is to give them positive feedback with a small twist at the end, right? So I'll illustrate this. So at the example of being condescending to the maintenance workers, you could say something like, you really like how they treat the administrative staff. You like how they treat people who have the same job as they have. You like the way they treat the customers. And you're excited to see how they're building the same skill and compassion with the maintenance staff, or will build it. So really with this strategy, you're presuming change, or you're assuming there's an intent to change at some point, right? So this one's a little presumptuous. But notice here there's no negativity. Actually, you're demonstrating trust. You're trusting the narcissist and really looking forward to what they can become, looking at their potential. So I like this one because it's positive, and I think it can connect here with the fantasy and admiration pieces we see with narcissism, right? So another way to use it would be, you're really popular now. Imagine how popular you would be if you could get along with the maintenance staff. So kind of building on what they already want. They want to be admired. They have a fantasy of success and power. So this can really be used to fit in with those components of narcissism. The second strategy under this positive feedback strategy is going to them and saying, can you show me how you built such a positive and productive relationship with the maintenance staff? So this one becomes maybe a little disingenuous, which is one of the problems I have with it. But essentially here, you're taking whatever is positive and productive about that relationship and you're complimenting them on it, and you're really asking them for advice. How did you accomplish this? The idea here is that they'll like this admiration and they'll want to give you advice, and they'll become more productive and build a more positive relationship with the maintenance staff to fulfill, again, the potential that you're kind of seeing in them. So you're really saying to them, I need to learn from you. I want your advice. I sometimes worry that I'm not getting along with people as well as I could. Can you show me how to do that? Now, the problem here, of course, other than this strategy may not be effective, is that it could be used against you, right? So you're kind of highlighting potential flaws without being specific in order to help facilitate change. Someone who's narcissistic, particularly if they're Machiavellianistic, which is related to narcissism, they could use this against you later on. So all of these strategies have pros and cons, but I think the positive feedback strategy, in my opinion, I think works a little bit better than the negative, but technically both are ways to communicate that kind of, again, both bypass and utilize the narcissism. So for both these strategies, there are some negatives, right? So it's kind of like manipulation, which we don't want to get involved in. Can you stay authentic and still use these techniques? Well, I think it's possible, but a lot of caution must be applied here. You don't want to say something inauthentic or disingenuous. You have to be careful with these strategies. And they might, in real life, be a little harsher than I've explained. There might have to be a little bit of a critical component in there. But again, I would emphasize trying to avoid criticism, because that's when the narcissist is usually going to shut down and be defensive. So in order to communicate the point, depending on how much time you have and how serious the behavioral change is, how necessary it is, that would really dictate how much criticism would be used. How urgent is the situation? Now remember, these techniques may not work at all. Narcissism is challenging, particularly if it's pathological. So whenever you're talking about a personality trait, you just have to be realistic about how much change would be expected and how long that change will last. The positive of these techniques, well, the key positive here is they avoid resistance. So that's really, I think, the main positive attribute that we can see in both of these techniques. They're kind of going around the resistance and at least giving you an opportunity to facilitate change. Now, I know whenever I talk about narcissism and change, right, there's going to be a lot of different opinions. You may agree or disagree with me or have other opinions. Please put those thoughts in the comments. It always generates a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of how to facilitate change in a narcissist to be interesting. Thanks for watching.